Welcome, everybody. My name is Kevin Wagner. I am a professor of political science at Florida Atlantic University. As you can see on the slide, I have an MA, a JD, and a PhD, or as my father always likes to say, I have a few more degrees than a compass. I study American politics, and I also I write a column on American politics for the Palm Beach Post, which you may or may not have seen. If you get the Post on Sundays, you will see my column right next to the editorials. So I write about American politics, and this week I think I wrote about whether or not the president can turn off Twitter. So if you're interested in that, check out my column. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the presidential election. So let me give you my basic caveats and thoughts and ideas here about how I approach this. I am attempting to be as nonpartisan as is humanly possible in this environment. What I mean by that is I presume, especially if you come to a lecture like this, that you form some opinions about politics, and I'm not here to challenge your opinions or to make you change your mind about how you feel about the president or Joe Biden or anybody else. What I am here to do is give you some thoughts and ideas about the political process, some information, maybe a chuckle or two, and then to answer any questions that you might have. So hopefully we can have some fun together and learn a little bit at the same time. So here we go. Let's see if I can get this to work. All right. This is my image of the day. I looked this up today because I got asked a question by a student about the NASCAR ban on the Confederate flag. So, so this got me actually interested in the subject of the Confederate flag, and I actually looked it up. What you are looking at, believe it or not, is the Confederate flag. How many of you knew that this was the Confederate flag? Yeah, a couple. I see a couple of you waving. Yeah, this is the actual. Well, well, in fairness, they had more than one flag, but this was the one that was the most used Confederate flag. The one that we call the Confederate flag today, the stars and bars, as they say, was actually the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. But this was the actual true Confederate flag. Interestingly. This one never really got as popular as the battle flag, which is sort of a red background with an X and the 13 stars arranged in it. The NASCAR people have apparently banned the battle flag from going forward, but I don't know if they banned this one. So we could see a smart Confederate trying to see if they could get this one going. So, so here's the story of the day, which is that that apparently we might be getting the convention, Republican convention, after all. For those of you that are not familiar, the original convention was supposed to be in North Carolina, and the governor of North Carolina has refused to confirm that they can conduct a convention quite like this one. And as you can see in this one, lots of people all piled into one place, not a lot of social distancing going on here, and not too many masks. Obviously, this was well before COVID-19. This was 2016, so obviously they wouldn't have to. But because they couldn't get confirmation that they could hold the convention the way they wanted to hold it, Republicans are actually talking about moving it to Jacksonville. So here's some interesting thoughts, by the way, about that. First of all, most of you may not know this, but Jacksonville is in fact the largest city in Florida. How many of you thought it was Miami? A couple? Nobody? Yeah, Jacksonville is about 921,000 people, so it actually is the biggest city in Florida. The problem with Jacksonville, though, as a venue for the national convention, is we expect somewhere in the neighborhood of around 50,000 people to come to a convention. The Jacksonville area, the main city, has about 2,300 hotel rooms. Which makes it kind of hard to host a convention. For those of you that remember when they had the Super Bowl, they actually increased their hotel rooms by bringing cruise ships to Jacksonville and having people who are going to the Super Bowl stay on a cruise ship. Not so sure that that would be a good option in the COVID-19 era, but that's just one of the sort of issues that they'll have to figure out. They're also going to keep some of the RNC activities in Charlotte. So people might have to fly back and forth from Charlotte to Jacksonville. And there already is a petition in Jacksonville to stop them from having the convention in Jacksonville. So we'll ultimately see how it goes. But there you have it. Florida might be getting the convention. Those of you that are interested, by the way, about the political science on this issue, there's actually not much evidence that a state hosting a convention votes for the party that's giving them the convention any more than it does normally. In other words, there doesn't seem to be much of a boost by holding the convention in your state. So the Democrats might have some wistful feelings about Wisconsin because that's where they're maybe holding theirs, and maybe the Republicans in either North Carolina or Florida. But there isn't much evidence that that's really going to give them much of a boost in the state. But we'll hang on and check it out just in case. So you might not have noticed, but we actually had 2 election days the last 2 Tuesdays in various states. What did we learn? Not a great deal, actually. A couple of notes that you might find interesting. Teresa Greenfield has become the candidate that is going to battle Joni Ernst in Iowa, and Iowa we've been a trending Republican state, but the early polling suggests that actually could be a very competitive race. Joni Ernst, you might remember, was the candidate whose claim to fame was that she was going to go to Washington and make the pigs squeal. That's her famous ad. But we'll see if she can hold on to her seat. An interesting sort of side note in politics, Valerie Plame, who you might remember was the former CIA operative who was at the center of one of the scandals during the Bush presidency. She was allegedly outed by a member of the vice president's staff as a CIA agent. She actually ran for office as a Democrat in Arizona, and she lost. So that is probably the end of her relatively short political career. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer survived an easy challenge from the left, so he will probably be back in Congress. Voters in Ferguson, Missouri elected Ella Jones as the first Black mayor in the city's history. That is interesting. And Joe Biden is essentially the official Democratic nominee by clenching enough votes, delegates to actually have the majority. Also, what happened yesterday, we just found out about today, John Ossoff, who you might remember as the Democrat who lost a close race in a congressional district in Georgia, has become a nominee for the Senate in Georgia in a very competitive race there. Not too much else terribly interesting. West Virginia Senator Shelley Moore Caputo found out who her opponent was, but it's really not going to matter. That's a very Republican state. She's probably pretty safe. And Joe Cunningham in South Carolina, who's a threatened Democrat, is going to be faced with Nancy Mace. Is going to be so a few of the primaries were settled. A few other things we saw, by the way, that voting was really hard in places like Georgia, where they had long lines. I suspect that might be a problem come November, but we'll have to keep an eye on that. Here's my piece of political wisdom for the day. George Washington is the only president who didn't blame the previous administration. Probably because he couldn't. But that is the nature of politics. Let's look at a couple of big issues of the day. The first I want to take a look at is COVID-19 and how that's affecting the election. What you're looking at here is President Trump's approval rating based on how people perceive that he is doing handling the coronavirus outbreak. And I think, one of the interesting lessons about 2020 politics is how much we see things through very partisan lenses. In other words, Republicans and Democrats see a very, very different world around them, which makes for a very difficult election, I would think. But take a look at the 3 lines on this chart. The highest line is what Republicans think of how the president has handled the COVID outbreak. And you can see, generally speaking, that line is so much higher than either independents or Democrats. About 84% of Republicans think the president has handled it well. And you can see among independents, it's about 40%. And among Democrats, unsurprisingly, it's about 14.5%. So the big issue ultimately is a highly partisan one, and the president is doing pretty well with his own party. The fascinating thing as a political scientist is whether or not those numbers will stay high, especially among Republicans, if, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be as serious and difficult as it's been. I mean, right now, if you look at the data, COVID-19 is killing about 1,000 Americans a day, almost every day. The total number of deaths in the United States is now about 112,000, and the total number of cases that are confirmed is around 2 million. By next week, COVID will have killed more Americans than died in World War I, which was 116,000. More than twice as many doughboys who died in combat, which was around 53,000. And a lot more people than were killed, at least initially, by the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was around 63,000. There hasn't been a lot of talk about COVID-19, but I do think it's going to be a serious issue come November, and not even stepping aside from politics, a very serious health issue in the United States for some time to come. What is interesting about it, sort of from a national standpoint as well, is that while New York seems to have the problem at least more under control than they did a month or two ago, the coronavirus is actually is raging in many states that initially didn't have a problem, including many states in the Deep South. It's problematic in meatpacking plants and other facilities where people generally are stuck together. The top 3 states for new cases right now are Arizona, North Carolina, and I bet you can guess what the third one is, Florida. All of them are key swing states in the election. So, you know, I mean, the most important thing obviously is health, but obviously this is going to have a fairly significant effect on how people vote, choose to vote, and who they vote for come November. So issue number 2 that is without a doubt dominating the political coverage of America right now is, of course, the protests following the killing of George Floyd. What is interesting here, by the way, is that the numbers aren't quite as partisan as they are on COVID-19. So here was the question. This was asked by a Washington Post poll, about 1,000 adults. And they asked them, do you support or oppose the protests following Floyd's killing that have taken place in cities across the country? Now look at the top one, all adults. The support is 74%. So that means 3 out of 4 Americans support the protest, which, by the way, I have to tell you, when I was looking for these numbers, I did not think they would be that high. It's surprisingly high. Now, if you look at the next one down, the second line, that's Democrats. And of course, that is even higher. That's at 87%. So nearly 9 out of 10 Democrats support the protest. But look at the independent number. That's the third line down. That's 76%. That is a remarkably high number for independents. And even among Republicans, look at the bottom line. It's still 53% of Republicans support the protest. So it's quite fascinating to me. Right before this lecture, I was writing a chapter in a book about the role of social media in campaigns and elections. It's not my best work between me and you, but it's hard to write these days, isn't it? Don't you find it hard to concentrate on task? But one of the things I was talking about in that chapter was that, for the most part, politicians are very good at controlling the narrative about stories to their supporters. For example, a Democrat like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden puts a particular narrative about an event, and Democrats tend to believe it. And Donald Trump puts a particular narrative about his event, and Republicans tend to believe it. This is one of the few issues where it's pretty clear that the majority of Americans are fairly strongly on the same page, which is surprising to me. I'd be interested to see if that actually holds up, and then Americans still are generally supportive of the protest in a month or 2 months. But it is fascinating, and is very much worth keeping an eye on. Some other data that I didn't put in this chart: about 66% in a second poll of independents also supportive of this, so that actually supports this number. And about 61% of adults disapprove of how the president has handled the protests, according to this Post poll. 59% disapprove in the second poll that I looked at. So both relatively close, and the president not doing too well on that. Of the groups that they looked at, young people, African Americans, and Latinos were the most disapproving of Trump's response, and older Americans and Caucasian Americans the least disapproving. All right. So here's my make you laugh, since I have two very serious slides. Unless you're a Bloomberg supporter, then you might not laugh. I call this the money can't buy you love data. And you know, I probably should let Bloomberg go since he's long out of the race, but I thought I'd share this with you just because it's so fascinating to me. So Michael Bloomberg spent a lot of money, as you might gather, on ads, and so what you're looking at is how much money he spent in certain states and how many votes he got. So if you look at the top line, it's Minnesota, the great state of Minnesota. And in that, you can see his vote share was 8.3%, meaning he got 8.3% of the Democratic primary vote in Minnesota. The next number is 13 million. That's the amount of money he spent. The next number is the number of votes he got, which is 62,000. So if you divide up what he spent among the votes he got, he literally spent, ready for this, $220 per vote, making Minnesota the single most expensive state for him. He spent $54 million in Texas for 313,000 votes, or about 15%. That comes out to $170 per vote. In Vermont, he spent also about $170 per vote. In Alaska, he spent $9 million. For those of you not familiar, Alaska is a particularly inexpensive state to advertise in. If you spend $9 million in Alaska, you've spent, I'm sorry, I said Alaska, didn't I? That's actually Alabama, which also, by the way, is a particularly inexpensive state. You spend $9 million in Alabama, you spent some money. That didn't get him many votes, only 53,000. You can see Oklahoma, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. I suspect many of those voters in those states probably would have said to Michael Bloomberg, if you just send me the check, that'll cover it. But it didn't work out too well for them ultimately. The good news for Michael Bloomberg is I hear he's still very rich anyway, so it'll work out for him. One of the interesting things I think about the modern state of American politics is what we trust and what we don't trust, and ultimately where we get our news and what that means. What you're looking at is a poll done by a polling firm called Morning Consult, and what they asked was, what media outlets are most credible to you? Now, if you're thinking about it yourself, you're probably thinking about which ones that you watch. Say in the morning, are you a Fox and Friends watcher? Are you a Morning Joe watcher? In the evening, are you a Tucker Carlson watcher, or a Rachel Maddow, or an Anderson Cooper watcher? We all have our different ones that we watch, but there is a strikingly divide between what Republicans and Democrats watch. Just for fun, go to the left-hand column with me for a second and look at what ones Democrats find the most credible. And you can see ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and the New York Times are all within 3 percentage points of it. So all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those sources are actually pretty much okay for Democrats. And you can see if you jump to the bottom, you can see the ones that Democrats don't like, including Fox News, which they find, you can see 47% find not credible. The Onion, Breitbart, and InfoWars. Not terribly surprising, those three, right? Look at the Republican side. You're probably not surprised to learn that the one that Republicans find most credible is Fox News, followed by the Wall Street Journal, and then it drops all the way down to 59% find ABC credible. So notice the difference between ABC and Fox. You do quick math in your head, right? That's about 14 percentage points. So Fox is way ahead of ABC and significantly ahead, 9 points ahead of the Wall Street Journal. So for Republicans and especially conservatives, it's Fox and then kind of everything else. Where if you look back at Democrats split their watching across ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, New York Times. What I actually find amusing, by the way, is MSNBC for Democrats is well down the list, right? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th on the list for Democrats. So it isn't really the equivalent of Fox for Democrats, at least not yet. It does lead to one sort of very interesting kind of a phenomenon, which is Fox News is at once the most trusted and the least trusted media outlet. So look at the Democratic side again, and look at the not too credible or not credible at all column, and notice that Fox sticks out on the Democratic side farther than any other one. So among Democrats, They're not sure which one they like the best. There's 5 that they generally like, but they are sure which one they like the least, and that's clearly Fox News. On the Republican side, you have the opposite effect, right? They're pretty sure they know which one they like best. That's Fox News, but they're also not terribly sure which one they like least. I mean, generally MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, NBC, they're all within striking range of each other. So there is consensus among Republicans about what they like, not necessarily about what they don't like. They don't like a lot of them. And among Democrats, they like a lot of them, but they're pretty sure they don't like Fox, which has created, ready for this interesting phenomenon? If you crunch all this data together, Fox News is the most trusted and the least trusted media source in America. It's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Because the Democrats and the more liberals find it the least trustworthy, and conservatives and Republicans find it the most trustworthy. So when you combine those together, it jumps to the top of both columns. It's quite fascinating, actually. It shows you a little bit about how we consume media in this country. So what is the state of the race? So what you're looking at is the approval, disapproval numbers for President Trump as of today. I updated that today. And so let me give you some thought about how you interpret the numbers. So you can clearly see the line, and right now the average is 55% disapproval and 41% approve. What this is this is from a blog called 538. And what they do is they take all the relatively well-known polls and they average them. And you see the little dots, little orange dots and little green dots. Those are individual polls. And the line is the average between the polls. And so you can see the average right now is actually one of the worst numbers for the president, actually 55% disapproval. And you can actually see, look at the last, inch of the lines on both sides. You can see it's actually gotten pretty bad for the president in the last few weeks to the last month. He's had the coronavirus and also, of course, the protests, which generally have pushed down his numbers. But here's the thing, just stepping aside for a second, here's the thing that I think is one of the more remarkable things about President Trump and approval ratings. His numbers have been remarkably steady. And what I mean by that is his approval doesn't change much, and his disapproval historically during the first 3 years hasn't changed much either. You can generally say that somewhere between 38, the high 30s to the low 40s is his approval rating, and it's been there basically his whole presidency. And you can say on disapproval, it's usually sorry, I had to unmute myself again.
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
There was some background noise.
Yeah, no worries. We're all good. So the president's had actually relatively steady numbers. And there was some interesting social science work done just in the last few weeks suggesting that among Americans, 95% of Americans are relatively well settled in what they believe or think about the president. In fact, there's so few people to persuade. It makes it one of the more unique elections in the modern era, which is there's really nobody that hasn't really, nobody's probably too strong a way to put it, but the vast majority of Americans have made their mind up about what they think about the president, and it's not likely to change going forward. So what does it mean? Now, I suspect a few of you who are president supporters are looking at these numbers and wondering, does this mean he's going to lose? And the short answer is no, it doesn't mean he's going to lose. Like I said, his support has been pretty steady. It's going to go down to this. It's going to be a question of whether or not either side gets their voters to turn out in higher numbers. And if the president can get strong turnout among his supporters, and Democrats don't turn out in the way that they didn't for Hillary Clinton in 2016, he certainly could win. So even though his disapproval number is high, as we always like to say in political science, we only count the votes of the people that vote. Even though we might poll people, everybody, we're going to try and elections are won by the people who get their voters to the election box. And in 2016, the president was very, very effective at doing that. Now, if you're curious, this is historically, there we go. this is historically how the president is doing at this time in his administration versus other recent presidents. So you can see the top left-hand corner is Barack Obama, and you can see at this same time in his first term as president, Barack Obama's approval rating was around 47.1, so about 47%. So compared to Mr. Trump, who's at 42%, Obama was clearly doing a bit better. You can see it's a little closer for George W. Bush, only a 3-point difference between where Bush was at this time and where Mr. Trump is. You can see Bill Clinton was doing a great deal better. Bill Clinton was over 50%. He was at 53.3% at this time, so well ahead of Mr. Trump. George H.W. Bush, very close, right? You can see Herbert Walker Bush was actually doing worse than Donald Trump was at this stage. So contrary to some things you might hear in the media, Donald Trump is not doing the worst that other presidents in recent memory have done. You can see George W. Bush did worse at this time. That might be reassuring if you're a supporter of the president. Here's the part that's probably not be reassuring. George H.W. Bush lost. So the fact that he wasn't doing well actually turned out to be somewhat predictive. Look at Ronald Reagan's numbers, almost 54%. And Ronald Reagan cruised to victory in his second term. So you can see his high approval number actually translated pretty well. Jimmy Carter also doing worse than Donald Trump was at this stage. Jimmy Carter's support was at 38.5. So if you round up 39%. So again, Trump doing better than Carter was at this stage. Of course, again, the bad news for Mr. Trump on that reflection, of course, is that Jimmy Carter also lost his bid for re-election. As just a general aside in political science lore, presidents seeking re-election typically win. We generally re-elect presidents. The times when we don't re-elect presidents, there's actually a pretty good indicator for non-re-election of the president. Can you guess what it is? Look at the two presidents on here that lost. What did they have in common? See, it's really easy for me to ask questions like that when you're muted. You can't give me an answer. All right, so you're just going to have to take my word for it if you got it right. Recessions. Presidents lose when there is a recession. And in Jimmy Carter's case and George H.W. Bush's case, they both had a large economic downturn right before the election. So here's the question for us to ponder together, right? Is the downturn that we currently are in the economy, I guess they officially said that the second quarter of this year was officially a recession, right? Is that going to be predictive and suggest that Mr. Trump is going to lose? Or, since the stock market has come back substantially and the unemployment numbers were actually better than they expected this month, is the return of the economic growth indicators in the last month and then maybe in the next few months going to help Donald Trump actually win in November? Now you're probably asking yourself, aren't you supposed to answer those questions, Dr. Wagner? And the answer is, I'm not sure. This is a very, very unique environment. But if I was going to tell you what I can tell you about what our data has historically shown is that presidents do well when people think the economy is doing well, and presidents do badly when they think the economy is going badly. So that might be your best predictor out of everything else and all the noise you hear on TV. Follow those economic indicators. And how do I know the president knows this? Because he speaks a lot about economic indicators, and he's very concerned about them. So he certainly knows a little bit of his history on this. So I've talked about the president. Let's talk about Mr. Biden. How is Joe doing historically? What you are looking at here, just for fun, I thought I'd share these numbers with you and see what you think. On the bottom of this slide, what you're looking at is a average of Clinton's polling averages in 2016 by month compared to Joe Biden's averages this year. And so look at the first column. It's January, actually the first row. January. So you can see in January, Hillary Clinton was averaging about 47.5% in the polls. Joe Biden in January was averaging about 50%. So Joe Biden was actually doing about 2.5 points better than Hillary Clinton. By February, Biden was doing about 4%, 3.7% better than Hillary Clinton. So pretty good. By March, by the way, look, they were dead even. In April, Hillary Clinton was at 48.5% and Joe Biden was at 47.4%. So Clinton was actually a little bit ahead of Joe Biden in April. By May, Biden had switched and he's back ahead by about a point, 2 points. By June, you can see Biden's numbers have really started to come up, and Biden is up by about 4.2% over where Hillary Clinton was in June. There was an interesting pattern here, by the way. Hillary Clinton's numbers, if you just look at her column, you can see her numbers started off at 47, 46, 49, 48, and then after April is when her numbers started to sink. So you saw 48, 46, 45. Her numbers actually continued to decline all the way. They steadied themselves into the fall, but they never reached their high of nearly 50% that she had in March. The interesting thing for Biden is he has a bit of a reverse pattern. His numbers dipped a little bit, you can see in April and then May, but then came back in June to about 50%. So the trend line for Biden is actually a bit better than the trend line was for Hillary Clinton. And but we'll have to see if that holds up. I mean, we're really talking about relatively small margins. Now, for fun, I threw Donald Trump into our chart so we can see how Trump is doing from 2016 to 2020. Have you gotten the idea that I love numbers yet? It's a weakness of mine. But look at the Trump column in 2016. You can see he was at 44% in January. Then if you drop down one, he's at 42.5 in February, 39, then 40, 43, and then 39. You can see his numbers declined from January and were near lows in June. He actually came back up a bit, and you can see that for the most part, Hillary Clinton was well ahead of Donald Trump most of the time. 3.5 points in January. In March, she was 10 points ahead. In April, she was 8 points ahead. In May, she was 3 points ahead, and in June, about 6 points ahead. What's interesting here, if I continued the chart, maybe if I come back, I'll show you some more numbers as we get closer to the election. Those numbers actually got considerably tighter between Trump and Clinton, usually about 2 points to 3 points. Clinton was generally ahead, but they were really actually quite tight. I think the perception that Hillary Clinton was definitely going to cruise to a win was based on our remembering the March and April numbers when she was double digits ahead in some polls, and are forgetting that by September and October, the race was actually within a couple of points. If you look at Biden compared to where Hillary Clinton was, which is kind of the interesting thing, you can see for the most part, his numbers have been steadily higher. But here's the interesting one, by the way. Look at Trump's numbers in 2020 compared to 2016. Do you see it? Trump's numbers are better in 2020 than they were in 2016. Which suggests, by the way, that Trump's support has fairly well consolidated in a way that it didn't necessarily in 2016. And I think that really speaks to the fact that most Republicans, or people that are still identifying as Republicans, are very supportive of the president, continue to be. And that's why his numbers have stayed relatively steady in the low 40s for most of the time period at issue. You can see, by the way, that Joe Biden, if you look at the last column, you can see Joe Biden has generally been ahead. And right now, June is actually Biden's largest average lead at around 7.7. So what does it mean? It means that it's June, and the election is until November. So it doesn't mean a whole lot in predictive capability, especially when you see that Hillary Clinton was 6 points ahead in June and Biden is 7 points ahead in June. And Hillary Clinton still managed to lose it. So for my Democratic friends out there, I think I would take this as a good sign, but I also would take it with a little bit of a grain of salt too about what it ultimately would predict in November. These things historically tend to get tighter as we get to November, and a lot is going to happen between now and then. So it should be kind of interesting to see. The average poll in June has Biden up by 7.7. We'll see if that holds up. Here's the interesting thing, by the way. Only about 8% of the voters in most of these polls are undecided. So if Trump is going to make up that ground, he has to convince voters that are voting for Biden, or at least right now are intending to vote for Biden, to change their mind. That's a little harder to do, and that might be, if I were to, for my President Trump supporters in our audience, that might be the part that I'd be most concerned about if I were a Trump supporter. The other thing that I think is interesting, if you look inside the numbers, President Trump has lost a fair amount of support among non-college educated white voters. Those are white voters who did not go to college. That was his best demographic in 2016. That dropped about 10% among non-college educated white voters. It used to be Trump about 65% and Biden about 35%. Now it's Trump dropped 5 and Biden went up 5. So he lost about 10% there. That's a tough one for Mr. Trump. He needs those the working class white voters in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, where those voters really carried him to victory. So that would be something for him to keep an eye on. The other thing is voters over the age of 65. Interestingly, Joe Biden is actually leading among that category, over 65 voters. That's a demographic, again, that Donald Trump won very comfortably over Hillary Clinton. So we'll have to see ultimately how that pans out. But very, very interesting to watch. We'll have to see where that goes. So what is your campaign strategy going forward? So I'm going to give you a little political science because I am a political scientist and you got me. So, so take a look at this chart. This is a YouGov poll. And it's asking Americans if they've heard a lot, some, a little, or none about each person here. And the top person there, of course, is Donald Trump. And 61% of Americans say they've heard a lot. 21% say they've heard some. 10% say they've heard a little. And 8% say they have heard none. I'd like to meet that 8% because I have no idea how that could possibly be. Whether you support the president or not, I think we would all agree that he has been very visible, very visible. But yet 8% say they've heard nothing about the president. Nonetheless, here's the big thing to take away from that. 85% have heard a lot or something about the president. And that suggests that's pretty consistent with what we understand, that most people sort of have determined that they know the president pretty well. And they either really like him or they really don't. And not many of them are going to be persuaded. Here's the fun part. Drop all the way down to the bottom of that chart. You see the last name is Joe Biden. Only 17% of Americans say they know a lot about Joe Biden. 31% say they know some. 28% say they know a little. And 24% say they know none. So what does that tell you? Well, one, it tells me that lots of Americans aren't paying attention because Joe Biden has been in politics for longer than most of, probably longer than I've been alive. Well, maybe it's close. But certainly a very, very long time Joe Biden has been in politics. But here's the interesting thing to think about. So a couple of political scientists from, I think from Yale, but don't quote me on that. Well, I think one was from Yale and one was from Berkeley. David Brockman and Joseph Kalla did a test. They showed people a lot of advertisements. And they showed them advertisements attacking Donald Trump, advertisements supporting Donald Trump, advertisements supporting Joe Biden, and advertisements attacking Joe Biden. The study consisted of about 291 messages across this sort of range. And they showed a random sample of them to 132,000 people. So it was a pretty big study. And they concluded the following, that anti-Trump messages didn't make one bit of difference. In other words, putting on a TV ad that was very critical of the president didn't change very many minds. But when they showed people pro-Joe Biden ads, they did. Now, think about it for a second. Why would that be? And the short answer is that for 95% of Americans, despite the 8% that said they know nothing about the president, there is really nothing for them to learn. They already know. And if they dislike the president, there's very little you're going to say that's going to convince them to like him. And if they like the president, there's very little you're going to say that's going to convince them to dislike him. The place for movement, look at the bottom line again for Joe Biden, the place for movement is for people to learn something about Joe Biden. So the advice for the Biden campaign is to not run ads against the president because that is already baked into the pie. Joe Biden should be running ads introducing himself and telling people what he supports. That actually should be the most effective. In fact, a friend of mine did a little bit of research on Senator Doug Jones, who, if you remember, is the Democratic senator from the great state of Alabama. You might want to say that a couple of times because it might be the last time you'll ever get to say the Democratic senator from the great state of Alabama. It's pretty rare. If you remember, he successfully won because he ran against Roy Moore, who was accused of, well, for lack of a better term, child molestation, I guess, to some degree or another, in 2017. Now, what is interesting is if you studied that race, the ad that was most effective for Jones wasn't an ad pointing out how bad Moore was. It was an ad that Jones used saying, supporting spending on education and healthcare. Interestingly, I think there's a lesson there too, which is people already knew who Roy Moore was. They either were going to support him or they weren't. Where there was room to move was in the candidate that they didn't know very much about. So let me flip the coin here for a second and say, well, if you're Donald Trump and you know this, what is the way that Donald Trump effectively campaigns here? And the answer is the same thing. Make it about Joe Biden, right? Donald Trump isn't going to convince people that don't like him to vote for him, and he's not going to lose voters that like him. So what he has to do is convince more voters not to like Joe Biden. You know, at the end of the day, a political race is just a race between two people. And at the end of the day, you have to pick one. So if you're both unpopular, that's fine, as long as you're slightly more popular than the other guy. Or as I like to say, it's the old bear in the woods phenomenon. I see puzzled faces. The bear in the woods phenomenon. Two people camping in the woods, sitting by the fire, and a bear bursts out. And they take off running. And the second guy looks at the first guy and he says, I don't think we can outrun this bear. And the first guy looks at the second guy and goes, I know, but we don't have to. I just have to outrun you. And that's politics, right? Donald Trump doesn't have to be the most popular person in America to win. He just has to be slightly more popular than Joe Biden. And if he can't improve his numbers, then he has to hurt Joe Biden's numbers. And so what I think this is going to translate into, by the way, is a very, very negative campaign. But I'm guessing you probably already knew that. Just to show you, by the way, that all my good advice is wasted. This is how they're advertising campaigns right now. This is out of the study done by Brockman and Kala. And if you look, advertising by Republicans, Trump has only done about 19% of his ads about Trump. 81% of his ads are about Joe Biden. So actually the Trump campaign quite gets it, right? That they have to attack Biden. But look at the Democratic side. 88%, that means 9 out of 10 of their ads are about Donald Trump. Only 10% of their ads are about Joe Biden. So the Republicans actually understand that the race really is about defining Joe Biden. Democrats haven't quite caught on yet, but we'll see if they do. As I like to tell all my political consultant friends, I'm not free, but I'm available to hire. So at the end of the day, an election really fundamentally is about not who wins the national popular vote. It's about who wins the right states. And what you're looking at is the states based on what the polling says would be the winner today. Anything there shock you? I'll tell you the one that I find hard to believe. Texas is white on this chart, which means that it's basically even. I don't believe it. You guys can call me up in November and tell me that I was wrong when I told you this in June. But Donald Trump is going to win Texas. I know too much about how Texas is a very conservative state. I have a hard time believing he's not going to win that. The other one that I think is interesting, look at up in the Ohio. See how that's colored? The outline is colored blue. That means the polling suggests right now it's leaning a little bit towards Joe Biden. Ohio has actually been Republican the last couple times through. And the trend line for Ohio has been to become more Republican. So that one, I'm not sure about. I'll tell you the state to watch, though, other than Florida, obviously. But we live here, so you're going to watch that one. Georgia. Georgia's a very interesting state. The polling in Georgia suggests it's going to be very, very tight. North Carolina, by the way, is also colored blue here. I would call that one more of a toss-up. But this is a map, if you were Joe Biden, you'd be pretty happy with. You can see in the far west, Nevada is outlined a little bit blue, which means it's close, but leaning for Biden. I feel comfortable about predicting Nevada will be blue in the same way I'm comfortable predicting Texas will be red. Those trend lines have been pretty steady for a while. But we'll see. I mean, there's an interesting sort of moral story here, which is we have a national election, but we're really only concerned about a handful of states. For example, if you live in California, we don't really care about your vote. Nobody's polling California. 1 in 8 Americans lives in California, and it is totally irrelevant to the national election because we already know it's going to be blue. I mean, that's true about some red states too. I mean, for the most part, we generally ignore Texas because we presume it's going to be red. We ignore Alabama, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Kansas, because they're all going to be red. No campaigns happen there. I actually remember last election cycle, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who lives in Kentucky. And I said to him, boy, am I so tired of all the political ads. I can't wait for this to be over. And I still remember what he said to me. He goes, they're running political ads? He lives in Kentucky. You know, it's a red state. It's going to vote for Trump no matter what. So it's just not a state that people compete with. We have a system where about 5 states matter. Here's the interesting thing. Florida matters probably the most of any of the states. Do you like being in a state that matters? Or would you rather be in like a state that's pretty comfortably one way or the other? Well, you don't really get to choose. Florida gets to matter. So the good news is you'll get to see lots of political ads. I'm sure you're happy about that. Here's 5 of the states that are going to be the most important. North Carolina, Wisconsin, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And what does the polling say? You can see Biden has a little bit of a lead in most of them. A bigger lead in Michigan, by the way, than I thought he would have. Florida's pretty close. Wisconsin's close. North Carolina's pretty close. Whoever sweeps those states or wins the most of those states will probably be our next president. You feel comfortable leaving up the presidency to the state of Wisconsin? It might come down to Wisconsin. I think they should send us all some cheese for giving them the right to decide who the president's going to be. You interested in the United States Senate? I know I am. Whoever becomes the president is going to be very interested in the Senate. How does that one look? Looks really interesting to me. Right now there are 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. So, or Democrat identifying. We have a couple independents that are identifying one way or the other. Where is it interesting? Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. Georgia has 2 Senate races. Can we predict who's going to control the Senate? No, I mean, what makes it kind of interesting, I mean, if you're a Democrat, the good news for you on the Democratic side is Republicans have a lot more seats to defend. Based on the current rankings, it looks like it's going to be really close, very close, to see who controls the Senate. And Democrats have a shot, but they're already down one because they're going to lose the seat in Alabama. But they might pick up one in Maine, one in Colorado, one in Arizona, and they could potentially pick up 2 in Georgia. So it's interesting, or they might not, and Republicans will hold on. It's hard to say. Now, when it comes to the House, how am I doing on time? Ooh, miserably as usual. I only have about 30 more slides, so you're just going to have to hang with me. Do we care about the House? And the short answer is we do not. Currently, Democrats hold about 233 seats to 196 for Republicans, giving them a relatively stable 37-seat advantage. There are also 5 vacancies. 4 of the seats were previously held by Republicans and 1 held by Democrats. That means that Republicans have to hold on to the 4 vacants that were solidly Republican seats and then pick up 18 seats to win a majority. How likely is that? I would say pretty unlikely. The electoral environment really is not great for Republicans. They have more open seats to defend. The median race ratings for most of them are generally favorable towards the Democrats. And there really aren't that many seats that are competitive. We think that there's about 20 seats that could go either way. And that would mean basically the Republicans would have to pick up most, if not all of them. And that's probably unlikely in this environment for them to do. Traditionally, by the way, the party of the sitting president usually loses seats in Congress during midterm elections, almost always. There's only one or two occasions where that didn't happen, and one of them was after 9/11. So that's another trend line that's probably not too favorable for Republicans at this point. Here's your generic congressional ballot. And so what they were really asking people here is a really basic question, right? Which is, if you had on your choice to vote for Republican or Democrat, who would you vote for? And you can see the Democrats are up by about 8 points. This is probably not as predictive as most people on television like to tell you, because there's no names associated with it. It's just generic, but it does give you sort of a trend idea about what the state of the country is right now and what that means. So here's the age question. Is Joe Biden too old to be president? Well, look at some of the ages. I gave you a nice sampling of some of our younger and older presidents. So you can take a look. You can see James Buchanan was 65. Andrew Jackson was 61 with a bullet in him from a duel. Didn't seem to slow him down, though. James Monroe, 58. Madison was 57. Jefferson was 57. And you go down to the bottom, you can see some of our younger presidents. John Kennedy, 43. Bill Clinton, 46. And Barack Obama, 47. So Joe Biden is 77 years old. Is that a problem? Well, this is how various age groups think of Biden. Basically, 18 to 29 is about 23 points in favor of Joe Biden. 18 to 34, 21. 18 to 44, 16%. So older Americans are actually a little less supportive than younger Americans, believe it or not. Actually, I was reading the Clinton margin, but you can see the Biden margin is actually as good or slightly better than Clinton in some areas, though. She does a little bit better among 18 to 34s and 30 to 44s. But for the most part, Biden doesn't lose a lot of votes among young people. You know, one of the interesting ironies of the primary season is that the most popular candidate among young Democrats voting in the primary was not Pete Buttigieg, the young buck in the race. It was Bernie Sanders, who also is around the same age as Joe Biden. So young people are not afraid to vote for older candidates. That's for sure. I want to show you something that I think is really kind of fascinating. And if you leave here learning something, I bet you'll remember this one. So what this chart is showing you is the way states are going since 2000. So just for explanation purposes, drop down to Texas with me. You see the 19.22 at Texas? What that means is that from 2000 to today, Texas has become about 20% more Democratic over that time period. And look at Florida. Florida is 1.18% more Republican in that time period. But I think here's the interesting thing that I think we're observing. Look at the West. See California and Oregon and Washington and Nevada and Colorado. That's where Democrats are really starting to surge, right? And look at the center part of the country and the deep South, right? And Tennessee and Oklahoma, Louisiana. That's where Republicans are becoming even stronger. The interesting part of the race, look up at the Rust Belt area. Look at Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and especially Ohio. That's where Republicans are actually pushing back. That used to be a very strong Democratic area, but the strength of the Democratic Party is increasingly along the coast. You can see the growth in Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina, and out west. And Republicans are starting to do better in the Rust Belt and still relatively strong in the South. The interesting question, though, for Republicans going forward, though, is if this trend line continues, and Texas, who I've already told you I think Donald Trump is going to win, but in another 2 or 3 election cycles, Texas continues to become more Democratic. If Republicans lose Texas, Can you look at where they're starting to do well? Is there enough electoral votes for them to win? The short answer is unless they're coming up, they're doing better in New York, but not good enough. They're still well behind. The short answer is Republicans are in trouble if they don't have Texas. It's hard to come up with a winning coalition without Texas. But we're a little ways from that. But I think it's a very interesting trend line, a very, very interesting slide. Anyone remember this one? Anyone scared by this one? I thought I would share this for you just as a reminder of how elections can go wrong. This is the actual ballot from Palm Beach County on November 7th, 2000. This is the famous butterfly ballot. Scary, isn't it? Are you mildly frightened by it? It always scares me to look at it again. The top, if you're curious about what went wrong here, so look at the top hole where the arrow is pointing. That's if you wanted to vote for George Bush, you had to take your little pin and punch a hole in that where that 3 is pointing. If you wanted to vote for Al Gore, you didn't vote in the second hole. You actually had to go down to the 3rd hole. Do you see it? You had to go to the 3rd hole to punch. Because the second hole, look on the right side of the page, is actually a vote for Pat Buchanan. Do you see where the 4 is pointing? And so what happened for a lot of voters was, from some of the Gore voters, was that when they went to vote for Gore, they punched a hole in the second hole because they thought that that was the one for Gore when it was actually the one for Buchanan. This ballot, by the way, changed history. Absolutely changed history. If not for this ballot, Al Gore probably would have been elected president. Think how different the world would have been. Without a doubt. All right, let me see about some of the questions. Tammy, did you get some, or do you want me? Oh, goodness, I just popped this up. Let's see what we got. Let's see. Do you think that the high approval with Republicans is due to the fact that most watch Fox or listen to right-wing radio? I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you can see me while I talk to you. So hold on. Stop share. All right. Can you see me now? I got a picture of somebody's fan. Somebody has their camera on their fan.
Yes,
right.
We can see you.
All right, good. Let's see. So the short answer is yes and no. I think what has become very, very apparent is that people consume media that is consistent with what they already believe. In political science, we call this cognitive dissonance, which is that feeling you get in your stomach when somebody tells you something that is inconsistent with your worldview, and you generally want to ignore it. So people tend to go to places where they tell them the things that they want to hear. And that is true for liberals and conservatives. It's just human nature. For example, right? Let's say you are a more liberal Democratic person, and you sit down in a car and the radio is playing Rush Limbaugh. You probably think to yourself, oh, please change the station, right? And because you can't take it. That feeling is sort of what pushes us to go to media sources that tell us stuff that we kind of like. And in the modern age, if you go back, that's why I like talking to an audience. You guys, your history doesn't, it goes back a little farther than some of my students. I taught a class in American government one time. I was talking about Ronald Reagan, and I was talking about Reagan, and a student asked me, I will never forget this. Said, Reagan, is that the one after Lincoln? And I said, yes, he was definitely after Lincoln. But if you remember media, and you can remember time when we didn't have all these stations, there was like 3 places to get news, right? You got Walter Cronkite, and everyone sort of collectively went to the same place. Today, we can go any number of places, right? And increasingly, we go to places that tell us what we want to hear. What else do we got? How concerned should we be regarding voter suppression? Yeah, I think we should be concerned. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's a very famous book in political science called The Art of Political Manipulation. It's written by a guy named William Riker, if you actually are interested in reading it. And what Riker said is that I can tell you how an election is going to come out if you let me write the rules. And because we fundamentally fight a lot over the rules is because most politicians know that. It's why we draw districts the way we do, and it's why we make it harder for voters that we're opposed to vote, and make it easier for voters that we think are going to like us to vote. And that goes on all over the country. And so especially if the party that you don't support is in power, they're going to tend to write the rules in a way that are more favorable towards them. That's just how it goes. So yeah, you definitely have a right to be concerned about that. How important is the VP pick for Biden? All right, I'm probably going to disappoint you by saying this, but the data doesn't really suggest that the VP pick is really all that important.
I'm sure.
You know, it's kind of one of those conventional wisdom things where we think it's really important, but it's really kind of a mixed bag. And VPs often don't even carry their own home state. So it's, you know, the one place where the VP sort of gives you some thoughts is it's the one thing that a presidential candidate is going to do that gives you some sense of what their judgment is going to be. And so, so who they pick tells you probably a bit more about the presidential candidate than it necessarily does about the VP. But in the end, people end up voting for the top of the ticket, usually not the bottom of the ticket, unless they really stick out like a sore thumb. And you know, like Sarah Palin probably was not the best pick for John McCain. It turned out. You know, I can see Russia from my house, right? You remember that one? Yeah. For the record, by the way, she didn't actually say that. You know who actually said that? Here's a little bit of trivia, so you'll come out and take some knowledge with you. That was actually Tina Fey on Saturday Night Live, who said, "I can see Russia from my house." Ironically, by the way, I've always thought Tina Fey was a better Sarah Palin than Sarah Palin.
I think he's right.
Do you think the messy recent election in Georgia bodes ill for the national election in November? So I was actually, it's a very good question. I actually had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine who's a professor at the University of Florida up in Gainesville. And we had a conversation about that. And a lot of people who study elections are actually very fearful that November is going to be a real mess. And you're going to have a lot of people voting by mail. The ballots are going to come in late. Counts are going to be happening well past election day, and you're going to have a lot of people complaining. And of course, the president, if the vote is not going well, likely will be talking about what he thinks are unfair things that are going on and how the various states count it. I think for America, the best thing would be for somebody to win overwhelmingly, because otherwise we might well have a giant mess on our hands. Someone pointed out LBJ helped JFK. I can't argue with that, Eric. You're right. He really did. Though for the most part, that's kind of the exception, not the rule. But that is a good point. I wouldn't argue with that. He certainly did. What happens about Biden if he dies in office? That is a really interesting point. It does make his pick for vice president a little more important. I remember when John McCain picked Sarah Palin, that because of McCain's age and his history with cancer, the pick of Palin actually was one that caused a lot of people to reflect on whether or not she would actually become president if something happened to John McCain. So that I actually think hurt John McCain. I think with Biden, he could have some of the same issues because, you know, he is not a young man. As far as I know, he's in good health though. But yeah, I think you're probably right, whoever sent that question. The VP pick might actually be a little more important for Biden, especially considering his age. If Trump loses in November, do you believe he will concede? Ooh, going for the easy questions, Eric, huh? I don't know. I think if Joe Biden wins, I think it'd probably be better for America if it was such an obvious win that there really wasn't a lot to contest. I think probably the worst case scenario for the United States would be a really close election that's decided by one last state that's counting votes days after the election, because you're going to get a lot of people arguing that there's fraud or deceit. And if you recall, the president was already sort of on that argument back in 2016, though he did ultimately win. So I guess he didn't think it was too deceitful at the time, I guess. But he was suggesting that some of the states were not counting properly. Not Florida. I hope not. We've had enough of the bad election issues in Florida, haven't we? But it could be. I mean, if there's going to be a close state that's pivotal, Wisconsin, Florida, Pennsylvania, maybe Georgia. And we have historically not been great at counting votes in this state. I think they're still counting the votes from the last election in Miami-Dade. So, so you may never know. I'm kidding. That was totally a joke. I'm pretty sure they're done counting over there. Maybe. Does anyone else have any other questions? I could give you a better answer to the VP. Who do I think Biden will pick? Because I bet you a few of you are wondering that. And I will tell you, by the way, that I have successfully failed to pick the VP choice pretty much every time. So you can take my prediction and go with that I'm wrong, because I usually am. I actually wrote last election cycle. No, I take that back. I did get it right one time. I wrote a column in USA Today suggesting that Hillary Clinton should pick Tim Kaine. Boy, was that bad advice. I probably shouldn't have written that column. But I did get the prediction right, so there is that. But Tim Kaine turned out not to be a great choice for Hillary Clinton. I still think it's going to be Kamala Harris. I think she checks a lot of the boxes for Joe Biden. I think the one is clearly not going to be is Klobuchar. I think it's pretty clear that her history in law enforcement and as a prosecutor probably don't fit the moment. But keep an eye on, by the way, Val Demings from Florida. I've heard from a couple of friends of mine. I won't tell you who, but I have a friend that was part of the Obama administration, so he has a couple of connections with the Biden administration. He actually likes Klobuchar, but he told me to watch Demings because they're looking at that one seriously. Let's see. Do you believe it is not beneficial to hammer away at Trump's character? So I try not to get into things that I believe or don't believe, because ultimately, it really doesn't matter what I believe. But I will tell you the data suggests that most people have made their mind up about what they think about Donald Trump, and there's not many people that if they still like Trump now, you're not going to convince them with a few more ads that he's not the guy that they think he is. And if they really dislike Trump, a couple of ads telling you that he's doing a good job are not going to change that. So I actually think it's probably more beneficial for Biden to focus on introducing himself and giving people who don't like Trump an option that they can like. At least if Biden were hiring me, that's what I would do. And if Trump hired me, I would tell him, go after Biden. You're not going to get a lot more people. Your approval ratings in the low 40s. That's about as high as it's going to get. So you got to get Biden's in the high 30s. So you have to go after. I like Val Demings. Okay, can't argue with you that. She's pretty good. The other name I heard, by the way, was the mayor of Atlanta, who apparently had a really good speech the other day. And I heard that the Biden campaign is going to vet her and see. I don't know. Can you go from mayor to vice president? I guess. A little unusual, but I guess. How do you rate Biden's campaign effectiveness to date? I hate to say it, but not great. I'll just be honest with you. I don't think it's been tremendous. But the good news for Biden is that so far it really hasn't been. I had a friend of mine sent me a text about a week ago when Trump had a pretty bad day. And he said that if Joe Biden,
Susan Rice.
Susan Rice, you're the second person that's asked me about Susan Rice. I don't know. I mean, she doesn't come from a typical place. She's not a governor or a mayor or a member of Congress, and she does have some baggage associated with accusations related to things that went on during the Obama administration. I think she's very articulate. She'd probably do a very good job. Just not sure. It'd be an unusual kind of pick for a VP, but she's very interesting. But there you have it. What else we got here? Okay, well, I think I've covered just about all of them. Well, it's been really fun. I miss seeing you guys in person. I told my daughter. She said, "You remember Gleneagles?" And I said they had very good cookies there.
That's,
Cookies
you know,
work.
that seems to be what everybody seems to remember about our club is the cookies.
I don't know where you get them from, but they were really good. Well, you know what I do is I try not to eat too many cookies because I try not to eat too many cookies, but I bring them home for my kids. And so, I brought home cookies.
And everyone who attended a cookie.
I did bring them from another club, and my son, who is he's going to be 8 years old, he said to me, "These aren't as good." And so I said, "Well, I didn't go to Gleneagles this time. Can only
Yeah.
only pick."
Well, I can only imagine how many cookies that our members are missing out on.
We're saving them all up, right?
We're all gonna go after it as soon as we're able to return to the club. But Dr. Wagner, this was awesome. It was very eye-opening, and I learned so much. And we definitely appreciate you coming in tonight and taking the time. And I wanted to thank all my members for joining me tonight. We had about 98 people at the high end, and just about everybody stayed for the entire time. So I just wanted to give all of the members an applause. And Dr. Wagner, thank you so much. It was amazing.
Hopefully we'll be back and we can see how many of my predictions I got right. So.
All right, and if anybody wants to unmute and applaud, go for it. I just can't unmute you all. They're all applauding, if you can see. Yay!
Oh, Judy.
Thank you.
Yay.
Awesome.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And everybody, we'll see you for trivia or for the lecture next Thursday. Okay. Have a good night.
Sounds good.
Me?